Good evening, everyone. I suspect most of you are here because you either know someone with Alzheimer's or you're worried about it. As he said, I am a neonatologist, so I take care of sick and premature newborns. But I'm going to be talking about Alzheimer's because my husband Steve has the early onset form of Alzheimer's disease. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview about Alzheimer's. According to the Alzheimer's Association, they say that number is now up to 5.5 million people that they estimate in the United States currently that have Alzheimer's, and about 30 million worldwide. And they expect that this number in the U.S. will jump to 15 million by the year 2050, based on the current trajectory that it's increasing, and 100 million worldwide by then. So this is an epidemic that's growing. 1 in 8 older Americans has Alzheimer's, and there are more than 200,000 people in this country under age 65 who have the early onset form of this disease. From the time you reach 65, every 5 years after that, your risk of Alzheimer's doubles, so that if you're 85 or older, it's about 50-50. So that's a frightening statistic. We all want to live a long life, but at what cost, potentially? So while deaths from stroke, heart disease, and certain cancers have declined steadily between 2000 and 2006, deaths from Alzheimer's during that time increased by 41.7%. So a lot of progress is happening in other diseases, but not so much in Alzheimer's disease. The cost of care to the government and businesses is estimated at $200 billion. And then the equivalent of $210 billion of unpaid caregiving. A lot of people are dealing with this at home. Spouses and children are taking care of them. So there's just vast sums of money, that aren't being paid to caregivers at this point. People who are familiar with Alzheimer's are familiar most often with the common hallmarks of the disease. Plaques and tangles in the brain. And this fuzzy thing here represents a plaque, and it's an accumulation of a substance that becomes like a waxy deposit in the brain. And it can be toxic to neurons nearby. And then the tangles are the skeleton of the neuron, the axons and dendrites that connect neurons with other neurons, have a skeleton inside of them. And this will pull up out of the axons and dendrite and form a tangle that's on the inside of the neurons. So that's what the tangles are. And this is just a slide showing, like, if you took a cut through the brain and stained it, that this is what you would see in Alzheimer's disease, these plaques and tangles. This is a very interesting slide that is really looking at mice, and it's normal mice are the first two here. And this is the blood vessel structure in the brain. And it's, if any of you have ever seen the Bodies exhibit, they use a special technique to outline the blood vessels in various parts of the body. And that's what they did with this. And, in normal wild mice, you just see this nice, neat structure. And it looks like the back of a leaf almost. It's very interesting. But then in Alzheimer's mice, you see these sticky plaques attached to the blood vessels, and it's disrupted. There was recently there was some research that came out that Alzheimer's might also have what's called a vascular component to it, that the blood vessels are involved in it as well. And there's something called vascular dementia, that if you don't have Alzheimer's type dementia, the next most common is vascular dementia. But Alzheimer's might have a component of vascular dementia as well. And this is a very close-up of one of these plaques. And this is a blood vessel. And you can see holes in the side of the blood vessel where these actually stick into it. And just very disrupted compared to a normal blood vessels. And this is another technique that just came out recently for somebody who's worried about Alzheimer's disease. And it probably will be used a lot in studies of drugs and other research related to Alzheimer's. There's an amyloid PET scan, and the beta amyloid is what accumulates as the plaques. And it if you have very dense areas of it, it shows up as this bright yellow, and moderately dense areas are red. And the interesting thing about this slide to me is that these people on the left have Alzheimer's disease. Clinically, they've been diagnosed as Alzheimer's, and the people on the right here are people who are normal. And you can see, like, this brain has a lot of amyloid in it, but this person is normal, doesn't have cognitive deficits. This person doesn't seem to have much amyloid, and yet has been diagnosed as Alzheimer's. So there's a lot of overlap, and it's not 100%. This test is not 100%, in other words, going to tell you if you have Alzheimer's or not. But a lot of people are getting tested. I think it's a little over $2,000 to have this test done, and but it might be useful in some ways, for research too. So getting back to Steve and I, Steve stayed home with our children, and he worked from our home as an accountant for my practice. I was at Meese Hospital, Dunedin, for many years, and it was just a wonderful setup, for our family. I have a job where I get called out any time of the day or night at the drop of a hat, for an emergency with a newborn, and he was able to stay home with our children, so that was a wonderful thing for us. But when he was only 51 years old in 2001, Steve started having problems with his accounting, making payroll mistakes, missing tax deadlines, and then he couldn't remember if he'd been to the bank and the post office. And he was also depressed at that point, and he saw a neuropsychiatrist who felt that most likely his problem was related to depression, because that can cause memory problems. And he mentioned dementia at that time, said he didn't really think that's what it was. But what we saw over the next few years is that he progressively did get worse, the more and more memory problems, and counting became more and more difficult. So he was diagnosed in 2004 as having early onset Alzheimer's disease. He saw a neurologist who had been recommended, someone who saw a lot of Alzheimer's patients. By 2006, he could no longer do any accounting at all, couldn't use a calculator or even do simple math. So over a matter of 5 years, he lost everything. And he was a guy who was on a computer all day long, and he could open it up and fix it. And by 5 years later, he couldn't even add 1 + 1 = 2. And there's this whole thing out there about use it or lose it, and he was using it every day, and it still deteriorated. So when you have this disease, it is relentless, and it is going to keep going and progressing. And also, right around that time, we found out that he couldn't read a map anymore, and he got lost. He was following our daughter home from Tallahassee. Her car had broken down, and a friend popped in the car with Steve and went up and fixed her car, and then he was supposed to follow her on the way home, and he made a wrong turn and ended up on I-10 and over in Jacksonville instead of down in, we were in, Spring Hill at that point. And so he's 3 hours away from home and called me. Luckily, he had a cell phone with him and could remember how to dial home and got him home. But shortly after that, he had to stop driving. So that was a major, for both of us, that was a major impact in our lives. So by the time he was 58, he started having tremors in his hands and in his jaw when he talked. He had a visual disturbance that kept him from reading, and he was an avid reader. He read novel after novel, and he couldn't read anymore, and he couldn't really explain at that point what the problem was. But later he said that he had, it was like pixels moving around on the page when he would try to read, and so he couldn't read anymore. And then his gait was weird. He would lift his feet up and walk slowly. He'd lift his feet a little abnormally high, and he couldn't run, just physically couldn't run. And his personality and his sense of humor were disappearing. And when he would go out to do something like cut the grass, he would start taking the lawn tractor apart, and the pieces would go missing instead of cutting the grass. And so, things were just getting worse, and he was really on a downward spiral at that point. And so in the spring of 2008, there was a new clinical trial that became available at the Bird Institute, and we had tried to get him into clinical trials before that, but he was disqualified because he'd had a history of depression. And I just thought that was very odd, because if you were his age and you were aware, as Steve was, he was very aware, that he had a problem, that he was deteriorating. He knew what he could do before, and he, knew that he couldn't do it anymore. It's very depressing, and that excluded him from being in these trials before that. But this time around, that was no longer a criteria that would exclude you. So we had some hope now, And so we went to the Bird Alzheimer Institute in Tampa, and he screened for the clinical trial. And there's a test called the mini mental status exam, and it's a 30-point test. And if you're normal, you'll get 30 points. It's a very simple test. And you needed 16 to get into the study, and Steve, this scored only 12, so he didn't get into the study, even though he met all the other criteria. When drugs are studied, they want to look at people with mild to moderate Alzheimer's who potentially have the most hope of recovering if the drug works, and so he was excluded for that reason. So that was extremely disappointing, and the doctor there told us that he could try again. So he said, come back in a couple weeks, and we'll let him try again. And he actually suggested that on the way down, I try to prep him, remind him it's Wednesday, and where we're headed, and things like that, so he might be able to gain a few points on the test. But he said, but if he actually has Alzheimer's, chances are he won't remember any of that. But they still gave us a little bit of hope that he could try again. And then we had another new drug came along, and both of these drugs were aimed at removing beta amyloid plaque from the brain, which a huge amount of research worldwide, millions of dollars invested in trying to remove beta amyloid, find drugs that do this, because it was believed that this was the cause of Alzheimer's disease. And since then, there's questions about that. But so that another drug became available, and I scheduled him for screenings 2 days in a row. And the night before the first screening, I thought, well, what if he gets accepted into both studies? You can only be in one clinical trial. So I got on the internet, and I started looking for the two drugs and the risks and the benefits of both drugs. And I came across a press release for another medical treatment. This was a medical food, and it was a compound called AC1202. It wasn't out yet. It was going to at least a year away, and it was they were looking towards getting FDA approval as a medical food. But it said that in half the people they tested with Alzheimer's, the memory and cognition improved, nearly half, and people with Alzheimer's. And this is not something you hear about Alzheimer's drugs. You hear that they slow the progression of the disease, but you don't hear that they actually improve memory and cognition. So I thought that was very interesting, but it didn't say what it was or how it worked. So I did a further search on the internet, and I was lucky enough to find their patent application, and it was 75 pages long. And it basically discussed a whole different aspect of Alzheimer's disease that I wasn't familiar with before, that it is a type of diabetes of the brain. And there's a group at Brown University. A lot of different groups have worked on this worldwide, but a group at Brown University had looked at the brains of people who have Alzheimer's and did not have type 1 or type 2 diabetes. And what they found was that there was insulin resistance and insulin deficiency in these brains. So a type of diabetes of the brain, and they called it type 3 diabetes to indicate Alzheimer's disease. And they further looked at brains of people with Alzheimer's at all different stages of the disease, and they found that this was present even in the earliest stages, and that it became more severe and more widespread through the brain with each subsequent stage of the disease until it was very severe and throughout most of the brain in the later stages of the disease. Other researchers have reported that this may be present decades, 10, 20 years before a person has symptoms. And when they do PET scans on people as young as their 20s who are at risk, that have family members with early onset, for example, they see decreased glucose uptake in the brain. Glucose needs insulin to get into the brain. So if there's insulin deficiency or insulin resistance, glucose isn't getting into the brain cells. So this shows someone who is normal, and you see the bright, this is different than the amyloid PET scan, but this is glucose that they're looking to see if it gets into the cells. And here is a normal brain. You see it lit up, yellow and red. And then this is an Alzheimer brain. You see these blue areas are areas where their glucose isn't really getting into the brain cells. So this is an important aspect of Alzheimer's that you don't hear about very much. But glucose is not the only fuel that the brain can use. As Dr. D'Agostino was saying a little bit ago, there are alternative fuels, and one of those is ketones. And this happens when you starve. If you happen to, our ancient ancestors and even people in the world today go through periods of starvation. And it's probably explains in many ways how we are able to evolve and continue to thrive as a species, that our brains and other organs can flip over very easily from using glucose to ketones bodies. And ketones could potentially then bypass the problem of insulin deficiency and insulin resistance in the brain if you could give the brain an alternative fuel. So this is actually a very simple diagram of a very, very complex process. And this just shows, this is a cell membrane, the square box. And this is glucose. And in this case, glucose can't get in. And there's all these steps once glucose does get into the cell and then enters into mitochondria, which are little organelles inside of our cells that produce ATP, which is the fuel basically that helps the cell carry out its functions. And since our person has problem getting glucose into these cells, ketones don't need insulin to get into the cell, and they get in and they enter this chemical cascade and bypassing several steps here that glucose needs, and so that gets in there, and then you can create ATP from this alternative fuel. But starvation is not the only way that you can do this. And it's not very practical for the long term if you have Alzheimer's or some other disease that you have periods of starvation. So back about 90 or so years ago, the classic ketogenic diet was discovered, that if you undertook this diet basically religiously, that you could elevate your ketones to the same levels as in starvation. And the classic ketogenic diet is a very high fat. It's like 80 or 90% of the calories is fat, very low carbohydrate, and just enough protein to maintain the lean body mass, or if you're a child, just enough to grow, to allow you to grow. Certain protein amino acids can be converted into glucose, so that's one of the reasons protein is limited. And it was found that certain children who have epilepsy that does not respond to drugs, for example, will stop having seizures. And these are children who sometimes have 100, 200, 300 seizures a day. After 4 or 5 days on the classic ketogenic diet, will completely stop having seizures. And there's some adults that respond to this too. Now, it's been found, but that diet's been around for about 90 or so years, and there's some popular versions of it. There are other modifications of this diet, but people use it for weight loss. For example, Atkins, people are familiar with that, and South Beach diet, which is a modification of the Atkins diet, produce relatively lower levels of ketosis than the classic ketogenic diet. But positive effects of the ketogenic diet have been reported in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and for weight loss and a number of other conditions. So back to the patent application, they talked about research by Dr. Richard Veech at the NIH in Rockville, Maryland, National Institutes of Health. And he's been studying ketones since the mid-90s and working on making a ketone ester, as Dominic talked about, that can raise ketone levels to the same level that you would have in starvation. But in this case, you wouldn't need to drastically change the diet in other ways. You can basically raise the ketone levels without doing that. And so while he's working on this, he found one of the projects that he did involved Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. And what he looked at were neurons and they put them in cell cultures. And they found that more neurons survived when they were exposed to substances that cause Parkinson's or Alzheimer's if the ketone body, beta-hydroxybutyrate, was added to the mix. This happens to be the ketone ester that he has been working on. And so the people who were developing this patent application for AC1202 latched on to this idea as well, but Dr. Sam Henderson, who was the inventor of AC1202, had a brilliant insight that perhaps even mild ketosis from a food, basically, could improve cognition and memory in people with Alzheimer's disease, that would be adequate to do that. And so he patented AC1202, which is basically medium-chain triglyceride oil. And this rang a bell with me because I'm a neonatologist. And back in the late 70s and early 1980s, we were using medium-chain triglyceride oil, or MCT oil, to supplement the feedings of our premature newborns. So what happens with medium-chain triglycerides is that when you consume them, they're taken up from the intestine. They don't require digestive enzymes to be digested, and they go into the liver, and they're converted partly in the liver to ketones. And then ketones cross the blood-brain barrier, they circulate, they cross the blood-brain barrier, and the cells can use them then for fuel in place of glucose. And again, it doesn't matter what you eat. If you take in medium-chain triglyceride oil, you will convert part of it to ketones. And the rest of the medium-chain triglyceride then is released into the circulation. And the interesting thing about it is it's never stored as fat. It's used immediately as energy. The mitochondria that I showed you earlier, medium-chain triglycerides do get into mitochondria. It's been shown for certain in muscle cells, and probably cardiac muscle cells as well. They do cross the blood-brain barrier, and they might be used by neurons as well as alternative fuel. But that hasn't been, it's not in the scientific literature yet. There's been some work with it, and we think it will be out, some, report of studies with this soon. But so the medium chain themselves may be an alternative fuel. So this product was basically just MCT oil. And I didn't know at that point that you could get it over the counter, which you can. $14 a quart on Amazon. It's very inexpensive. And, it's found in, as I said, we use it in a very tiny preemies. And then back in the 1980s, they started adding it in larger quantities to infant formulas. And they did this to mimic human breast milk, which has 10 to 17% of the fats as medium-chain triglycerides. And we don't naturally make medium-chain triglycerides in our bodies except in the woman who is lactating in her milk. She makes them, for the baby. And babies, if you've ever breastfed a baby or had a wife that breastfed a baby, it takes 36 or 48 hours for the milk to come in. So you think, what are they living off of, the baby, that first 36 or 48 hours? And, well, babies are fat, so they're able to break down the fat and convert some of it to ketones. And so babies go into ketosis that are strictly breastfed, and about 25% of the fuel to their brain is provided by ketones during those early days of life. So the formula manufacturers try to mimic breast milk, and so they started adding it, and then we basically stopped adding it to their feedings directly, the MCT oil, because it was in the premature infant formulas. So then, one thing I did not know about MCT oil at that point was that it was extracted from coconut oil, and this was in the patent application. And this was the aha moment for me because, I knew I had seen coconut oil in health food stores, and I thought, half the people with Alzheimer's that they studied improved after they had taken MCT oil. So. And I didn't know MCT oil was available over the counter. So I thought, what if I gave Steve coconut oil? Would he respond as these people did with MCT oil? So at this point, I finished reading this patent application, and it's 1 a.m., and Steve's scheduled at 9 a.m. for a screening for this clinical trial. So I didn't have time to run out and buy coconut oil. So Oh, but the other thing too about AC1202, before I get off of that, was that they've had 2 trials, and one, just a single dose of MCT oil increased cognition and memory. They had, I think, 7 tests that they did. It was 5 out of 7 tests. 90 minutes after they took it, these people had improvement just with 1 dose. And then this was a small pilot study, and they had people come twice. They got a control treatment the one time, and they got the MCT oil the other time. So they were basically their own control. And then they did a prolonged study over a period of months, and they really saw the same results, that nearly half the people responded. So this was very encouraging because, probably the best thing around, potentially for Alzheimer's disease. But we were still a year away from having this available at that point that I'm reading the patent application. And it was approved ultimately as a medical food by the FDA in the spring of 2009. But this was May of 2008. So Steve, we went down to St. Petersburg, and he went to screen for the clinical trial. And he scored only 14 out of 30 and needed 16 to get into the study, and the doctor said, well, let's have him do a clock test, which is a very specific test for Alzheimer's. And that is what he drew. That's supposed to be a clock. And you can see just a few little random circles and a few numbers not organized like a clock. And the doctor pulled me aside and said that he's on the verge of severe Alzheimer's. So this was very, nerve-wracking and upsetting. And so on the way home, I thought, what do we have to lose? We're going to go pick up some coconut oil. And, So when I got home, I got it back on the internet, and I looked up everything I could find about ketones, medium-chain triglycerides, coconut oil. I found the USDA has a food comparison, like a website where you can find the composition of pretty much any food, and coconut oil was there. And so I kind of had to refresh my biochemistry 101, what are the medium-chain triglycerides? And so I figured out that coconut oil is 60%, almost 60% medium-chain triglycerides. Well, that's a pretty hefty amount. And AC1202 basically was a 20-gram dose. That's 4 teaspoons of MCT oil, and that equated to 7 teaspoons of coconut oil. So gave Steve that for his breakfast, and coconut oil tends to be kind of solid at room temperature, and it melts very easily if you put it in anything warm. And so I added it to his oatmeal, and he scored, this time, 18 out of 30, and he actually qualified for the clinical trial. So that was a jump from 14 to 18, and at that point, I didn't know if it was truly the coconut oil versus just really good luck or prayers or, whatever. And so, but we decided we're going to continue this. And so I started giving Steve a measured amount every morning for breakfast, and then got every cookbook I could find on coconut oil and learning as much as I could about it. And we just started cooking with it and replacing other fats with it. And Steve, the day he started the coconut oil, many times after that, he said that the light switch came back on the day he started taking coconut oil. And he felt like he got his life back. So it was a big day for us. So what we saw over the next few days was, when he would come out in the morning from the bedroom, he would be very, very sluggish before, and he couldn't find a spoon or figure out how to get water out of the refrigerator, and not very talkative at all. And he started coming out with a bounce in his step and more talkative, and a sense of humor, and his personality. There's more animation in his face. And he didn't look quite so lost. And so we saw that his personality and sense of humor were resurfacing. And his facial tremor, and a tremor that he had when he would try to eat, basically went away pretty quickly. And by about the 4th or 5th day, we said, our life has changed for the better. We both felt that. And what we saw over the next weeks and months was that his personality came back, and that the tremors went away. And, we also saw that his gait improved over a couple months. His completely normal. and got to the point where he could actually run again. So physically, he got stronger, and he was able to start reading after about 3 or 4 months. And then he was able to explain to me what was wrong, why he couldn't read. And he explained to me about how it looked like the words were in pixels moving around on the page, but up to that point, he couldn't even articulate that to tell me why he couldn't read. But when it went away, he was extremely happy because he actually could read. Comprehension was another problem, but he could read out loud almost any length of word and read sentences and all of that. And then he, instead of taking his lawn tractor apart, he actually got on it and started cutting the grass again. So that was wonderful. And 2 weeks after he drew that clock, the day before the coconut oil, he drew the second clock. And this is a vast difference from that. It actually has a circle and has all the numbers in there. These spokes, I think he either was trying to line up the numbers or those were the hands of the clock, so still a lot of confusion there. And then this was 37 days later, a little bit cleaner. And then there's actually a fourth clock, but it never quite got finished, and it was 2 months after. And he folded the paper into fourths because he wanted to find the exact center of the page. And then he got very frustrated and he wrote on the paper, "They did not give me a compass nor a ruler." So I felt like, there's my perfectionist husband coming back. And about a month after we started it, we had a family reunion, and we had been back to Cincinnati a year earlier, and he didn't remember the names of certain nieces and brother-in-laws, and everybody said he looked lost, and the conversation didn't make sense with him. But this time, he recognized these, people he hadn't recognized the year before, brother-in-laws and nieces, and he participated in conversations. He made jokes, and everybody was like, "Whoa, what happened to him?" And I showed him the clocks, and it confirmed for me, that this was real, that this wasn't just my imagination. And so, some other things that happened were, over 2 months, he was we decided to try to test him for the other drug, and so we could make up our minds which study he wanted to be in. So he did score a 17 when he tried again for the other drug and qualified. And then at 65 days after starting coconut oil, he actually scored a 20, and this was at the day that he entered into a clinical trial. And you think, okay, so he's got this going on. How does he get into a clinical trial? Well, it was for an Eli Lilly drug, and they were advised of this dietary intervention, that had brought about improvement. And I guess they just didn't really believe it would screw up their results, so they let him into the clinical trial. And, at this point, I've got my caregiver wife hat on, not my doctor hat, I should object to this being a physician, but, as somebody who wants to see her husband live, a lot longer and a healthier life, who was I to turn down a clinical trial if he was accepted? So what we saw during the first year of the coconut oil, we found out later that he was on the placebo. So he wasn't getting this drug in the clinical trial for the first 12 to 14 months. And it was a crossover trial. At some point, you would get on the drug. So that's one of the reasons we chose that particular one. We knew eventually he would get on it, which turned out probably not to be such a good thing. But there's a more complex cognitive test called the Alzheimer's Disease Assessment Scale. And it's a 75-point test, and during that year, he improved by 6 points. Other people on the placebo dropped by a little over 6 points on average over 18 months who were in that same trial. And the activities of daily living is a 78-point test, and he improved by 14 points on that test over the first year. So people with Alzheimer's usually go down, they don't go up, over a year. And then 2 years after he started the coconut oil, at the beginning of the clinical trial, he'd had an MRI, and it was stable 2 years later. It hadn't gotten any worse, and he'd had quite a bit of worsening from 2004 to 2008. It was called normal in 2004, and by 2008, he had moderate to severe atrophy in the parts of the brain associated with Alzheimer's, but then it stabilized. He didn't really have any more worsening in his MRI over 2 years. So going back to June and July of 2008, when Steve improved so much, I felt like I was living in a parallel universe, that I knew something that nobody else knew. and that there were 30 million people in the world with Alzheimer's and families dealing with it. And somehow I had to get this message out that there was something on the shelf that people could do now, and possibly as many as half of people might have some improvement from it. And so I started a letter writing campaign. My first letter was to Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, because her husband had Alzheimer's at that time. He's passed on since then, but she was in the Alzheimer's study group, which works with the Alzheimer's Association. And I thought, my sister actually suggested she would be a good one to write a letter to. And so I wrote her a letter, and in it, I talked about AC-1202, this medical food. I felt like they were keeping it quiet because it was available over the counter. What their research had shown, that Steve was just one example of somebody who did improve with this, but that this, if they had their medical people, look at this, the science of this, that they would recognize it from Biochemistry 101, ketones as alternative fuel. I remembered studying that in biochemistry back in the 70s. And so I basically asked them to have their medical people look at it and put it on the fast track, get it out to the public that this could help some people. It's only a food. What is the harm? And that clinical trials, try to get clinical trials done for it. So I didn't, and then, I wrote to her, and I wrote to, and my reply basically was, well, we'll pass this on to the Alzheimer's Association and they'll investigate it and get back with you. Well, I didn't hear anything. And I also sent letters to all kinds of media people, politicians. We were in the middle of primaries, and Hillary and Obama, they were up against each other, and I sent it to them. I sent it to everybody I could think of, Oprah and Dr. Oz and, everybody, and not a single letter back or any, acknowledgement, of it. And so it was very frustrating. And the Alzheimer's Association at the end of July 2008 had a conference in Chicago. They have one every year, International Conference for Alzheimer's Disease. And 5,000 researchers from all around the world, these are MDs and PhDs, assemble to share the research, what's happened in the previous year. And they have a huge number of talks, all going on in multiple rooms, and 2,000 poster presentations. And so I thought, here's a perfect opportunity to get this message out. Maybe I can get some of these people interested in studying ketones. And so they have an exhibit hall at these conferences, and they had a table that I could get for $1,600. And so I wrote an article. I actually emailed it to the Alzheimer's Association, and I was approved to have a table in their exhibit hall. And I was thrilled. So I arranged to have like 1,500 copies made, and I was going to have more made, in Chicago. And 3 days before the conference, I got an email from them saying that they had reviewed my application and they had decided to decline, that they would not let me pass out my information. And I had a little email war back and forth with them, but this is just a food. You advocate for millions of people with Alzheimer's. What is the harm in at least acknowledging that this is something that could help? There is a clinical study out there with AC-1202. At that point, I knew MCT oil was available over the counter. People could be directed to MCT oil, but we went through things. You're not a corporation. You need to be a corporation, or you need to be selling something. I'm like, should I sell my article for $1 a piece, or But they just said, sorry, no, we aren't going to let you do this, and you can't even hand it out there to just buy, So that was really disappointing, but I went to the conference anyway. They said, you can come to the conference. I'm like, okay, and I did pass out a few, I have to tell you. But so I wrote an article all about, what I just told you, and about the ketone esters that are in development, and that this needs to get on the fast track. The clinical trials need to be done, and so Chicago was very disappointing. And but when we got home, I started passing it out at local health food stores and on the internet, sending it out to people. And in the fall of 2008, the St. Pete Times picked up on it, and they decided to run a story about Steve and I and what had happened with him and the clocks. And then this actually got out on the internet. It went viral, and I started hearing back then from other people who had tried it. And that was very gratifying. Some of those first letters, it was so gratifying to hear that other people had also responded like Steve. And so at this point, I've collected, this is a little bit of an old slide, but I've collected about almost 250 case reports, just people who emailed me. And, I don't tell them, I don't ask them, did you see this or this or this? I tell them, you tell me what you saw in your person. And I want to hear, even if they don't respond, So I think people are probably more likely to email me if they did see a response to it. So it's not really a scientific study. But 90% of the people that emailed me said that they did see a response, some type of improvement, and there were people that said we saw absolutely no improvement. But of the people that did improve, about almost 60% of them felt they saw some type of cognitive improvement, but others, saw improvements that are more quality of life and sometimes hard to measure on a test. We're talking recognition of family members like Steve, lifting of depression, improved behavior and mood, and improved ability to make conversation. I've actually had a couple people that hadn't been talking that started talking again, and those kind of things, or they were talking in a garbled way, and now we can understand what she's saying part of the time, and then improved physical symptoms. I hear that fairly often, and improved sleep, improved appetite. So, and people resuming activities that they had stopped doing. There was one lady, one of the first that I heard from, had started it shortly after she, read it online in the fall of 2008, and she told me, her mother, it took about 2 months before they realized how much she had changed over that 2-month period. It wasn't like day-to-day like Steve in the very beginning, but she was a lady that was in bed and didn't recognize family, had no appetite, was barely talking, and at the end of 2 months, she was actually getting out of bed, getting dressed, recognizing her family. She started eating again, and then she went to the refrigerator one day, and this is when the lady wrote me. She went to the refrigerator and opened it up, and her son thought she was getting in trouble, because people with Alzheimer's get in a lot of trouble. And she said, I'm looking for that Pepperidge Farm cake that we bought yesterday. And they had bought a cake, Pepperidge Farm cake yesterday, and they were all floored. And then she sat down at the table and read the newspaper, which she hadn't done for ages. And the lady that wrote me said, my father's jaw dropped, when she picked up and starts reading the newspaper. So, but those are the kind of stories. Some of them are pretty, to me, that is dramatic, but it took a couple months till it was obvious. And those are the kind of things. So for some people it's dramatic, some more subtle, and some, they feel like over a period of time they've seen stabilization, that they just don't see the person getting worse. Maybe they didn't see a big improvement, but they also haven't seen a decline over 6 months or a year. I get reports like that. So these are just some of the phrases from the emails that I got just directly from that. And like Dr. D'Agostino said, I made a spreadsheet out of all of these emails and just copy and paste, what they, reported to me. And so the Bird Center, Alzheimer's Center, they were able to use this information to get an animal study first, with looking at ketogenic diets and ketone esters in mice. And mice models, they don't really have Alzheimer's disease, but they have the closest thing that they can find, that they can get, in these mouse models. But now they're actually planning a human clinical trial that's going to start April 1st with a combination of MCT oil and coconut oil in people that have mild cognitive impairment, to see if it will improve symptoms and if it will prevent progression of Alzheimer's disease. So that's very exciting to me. So ketone esters are in development at the National Institutes of Health and the University of South Florida, and actually a couple of other places. And by comparison, the levels of ketones that you get with coconut oil and MCT oil are relatively low compared to what you get in starvation and classic ketogenic diet And with the ketone esters, you can really get any level, with a ketone ester. And even exercise, they talk about how exercise could prevent dementia. And a question in my mind is, decades ago they studied exercise and ketones, and they found that it does raise ketone levels to the same range, and that lasts for 8 or 9 hours after you exercise. So could it be that that's one reason why exercise may delay or keep you from getting dementia, that you're actually raising ketone levels that your brain can use. And then doctors worry a lot, when people bring a copy of my article to the office, some of the doctors, they know about it, and some actually recommend it to their patients, but a lot of others, poo-poo it, say this is too simple, this can't be. They don't review their chemistry, about the ketones and alternative fuels, but they worry a lot about diabetic ketoacidosis. You mentioned the word ketones, and to someone who's diabetic, that's something that they need to worry about. And when you go into diabetic ketoacidosis, though, your levels get much, much higher, probably at least 10 millimoles and as high as 25 millimoles. And the other problem is that you also do not have insulin. And in any of these other situations, you do have insulin available. So there's more to diabetic ketoacidosis than just raising ketone levels. And unless somebody is going into ketoacidosis, taking coconut oil, MCT oil would not be a problem. It really shouldn't be a problem. And if anything, it tends to lower the blood sugar. So I've had a lot of people with type 2 diabetes tell me that they found that their blood sugar control was better. That they had lower blood sugars, fasting blood sugars over time, when they were taking this. So, and if you think about it with a diabetic, multiple organs in the body have this insulin deficiency and insulin resistance, and all the cells, except the liver, can use ketones as an alternative fuel. So potentially it could prevent damage to other organs like the eyes and kidneys and skin, in somebody who's diabetic. So, not just for dementia. So this, at the beginning of this new year, Dr. Richard Veech at the NIH and his group published a new article, and they used an Alzheimer mouse model. This is probably the closest you can get to Alzheimer's. They have the plaques and tangles and cognitive defects, and they fed them a diet that had the ketone ester in it that he's been working on for years. And they found that it did reduce plaque and tangle in these brains, and also that they had improved memory and improved learning in these mice. So, this is some relatively exciting animal research that hopefully will stimulate funding for human research. Now, animal research is much less expensive than people research. And so that's, groups like the Alzheimer's Association, the government who dole out money want to see animal studies first, for that reason. But it all takes so much time. So, but ketones, they act as an alternative fuel, but they also have other properties, and so they actually, like when somebody is in starvation and their blood sugars are very low and they use up all their sugar, insulin levels are extremely low, and insulin does a lot more than just getting glucose into cells. And ketones substitute also for insulin. They do, carry out a lot of the same effects that insulin would carry out during starvation. So it can act as insulin. And also, when ketones are in circulation, even at very low levels, it increases blood flow to the brain by almost 40%. So, that could be another reason why, ketones are beneficial, that you just are basically getting more circulation to the brain. They also act as antioxidants, and they help reduce the generation of free radicals. Some of you might be familiar, with that we do have these molecules that can be damaging, that we produce in our bodies, that can damage mitochondria and surrounding, tissues and cells and that type of thing. And ketones actually can counteract some of that. And they also are anti-inflammatory. So if you have inflammation going on, they can help reduce inflammation. So just some other effects. So I did, having written the short article, I felt compelled to write a book. And it took many months, probably about 16 months of writing it, and many more months of getting it edited. But basically, it was all about ketones to try to increase awareness of ketones as an alternative fuel for the brain, this whole different aspect of Alzheimer's disease that you don't hear much about, that this can be achieved through food, that ketone esters are in development, and that clinical trials need to be done both for coconut oil and for MCT oil. But in the meantime, it's just the food, the coconut oil. And one of the main criticisms of my book was that, well, this idea hasn't had clinical trials. And so my answer to that is, without awareness of this idea in the first place, how would clinical trials ever be done, And it is just the food. So as I mentioned, University of South Florida Bird Alzheimer Institute is undertaking that study. And there's Dr. D'Agostino in his lab, and they are studying ketones for a number of different diseases, including oxygen toxicity, Alzheimer's, epilepsy, ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease. It's a very devastating disease. Most people that have that, you keep your memory and cognition, but your body wastes away to the point where you can't swallow and you can't breathe. And people who have this usually will die within 3 to 5 years, and it often, is younger people too. People in their 30s, will sometimes develop this, and it does happen in older people as well. But there's a doctor here in Tampa, Dr. Vince Tadone, who's found that chemical reaction, the chain, another substance in that same cycle, alpha-ketoglutarate, another supplement that's related to the ketones that seems to be helping his daughter. And so there's studies going on with that and with ketone esters and ketogenic diets in mice with ALS there. And the cancer is very exciting. Dr. D'Agostino, it's another whole talk, but it's a very, very, very exciting potential treatment for cancer that will shrink. How much time do I have? Not that much, okay. But so he'll have to come and talk to you about that because it's very exciting treatment that could help shrink the tumors so that they can be taken, removed surgically and that type of thing. So there are a number of diseases that have decreased glucose uptake in the cells and insulin resistance and insulin deficiency. And so I've heard from people with all of these conditions except Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and I do know there's a boy now that his family is trying this, but that have had some improvement. And like people don't know, for example, that people with Down syndrome, they have an extra chromosome that has one of the genes that's involved with the beta amyloid plaque, and so they actually have this early in life, and they virtually all will develop Alzheimer's if they live into their 30s and 40s. So, potentially, and I wonder, if you started, say, an infant or a child with Down syndrome, giving them medium-chain triglycerides or ketone ester, might it kind of relieve some of the problem of mental retardation that they experience? And then acute brain injury, both, our armed forces, there are a lot of problem with that, and auto accidents, day-to-day injuries that people have, sets them up for, you develop plaques and tangles in the area of the brain that is injured. And some people that have brain injuries will go on to develop Alzheimer's disease. That happened with Ronald Reagan. He fell off a horse and hit his head, and that's when it started for him. Became obvious after that. So these are some foods that do not have any medium-chain triglycerides, and these are the most common oils that are found in our typical American diet. So even olive oil does not have any medium-chain triglyceride in it, and fish oil doesn't. But if you take coconut oil, basically the only fat that it's missing that you need is omega-3 fatty acids. So it's very important to take fish oil or eat fish, to get that from the diet. And these are some foods that do have medium-chain fatty acids, and coconut oil is number one on the list. MCT oil is really the most concentrated form of medium chain. It's deliberately made that way, and it's actually used by bodybuilders, has been for a long, long time, to increase lean body mass. So you can find it in some health food stores. Just in Spring Hill, where I live, it's a little tiny town, and all of the health food stores carry MCT oil in my little town. As well as coconut oil. But it's also found in the milk fat of mammals, and that includes humans, goats, and cows. So, one of the things that has been stressed over recent years is that we should drink low-fat or fat-free milk. Well, if you do that, you're not getting any medium-chain triglycerides in your diet, and probably not absorbing calcium very well from the milk, you know. So, and goat milk actually has much more than cow milk does in it. And when they talk about the Mediterranean diet, one thing they don't mention in this country is that people in those areas drink goat milk. A lot of people drink goat milk, and maybe that's one thing that's part of the Mediterranean diet. You know, there are many other things in it, you know, that are very healthy too. But that might be one important thing about it that we should think about. So as far as coconut oil, any part of the coconut, except the water, doesn't really have much of the oil in it, if any. But these are just some other coconut things that you can do to get oil, you know, from it. Coconut milk is loaded with coconut oil, you know, so that you can get medium chain triglycerides with that, and it's actually very good. People ask me about coconut capsules all the time. I figured that will probably be one of the questions, so I'll just go ahead and address it now. But each capsule has only 1 gram, and there's 14 grams in a tablespoon of coconut oil. So you'd have to take 14 capsules to get 1 tablespoon of coconut oil. So that's very expensive and very hard thing to swallow, literally. Steve, we increased him over time, you know, so that he was getting it at least 3 times a day and finally 4 times a day. And Dr. Veech measured his ketone levels after he took coconut oil and MCT oil. And with coconut oil, his level of ketones peaked at about 3 hours, and they were still hanging around like 7 or 8 hours later. With MCT oil, the ketone level was higher, but it peaked at 90 minutes, and they were gone at 3 hours. So, like say the product AC1202, which is Axona, the dose is once a day. Well, it's gone after 3 hours or 4 hours. What do you do the rest of the day? So we started adding it to his diet for the other meals to try to keep ketones available to his brain 24/7. So that's why we do that. And then, you know, coconut oil, the lauric acid in it, one of the medium chain triglycerides, has antimicrobial, antibacterial, you know, type of properties to it. And so there are other good things about coconut oil, and that's what he improved with in the first place. So I've always been leery of taking that out of his diet and substituting it with just MCT oil. So this is just a recommendation for how to start. You know, if you some people, if they try to take too much oil too fast, will have diarrhea, and it's like major diarrhea. So I usually recommend to people that they start with 1 or 2 teaspoons, like 1 teaspoon, 2 or 3 times a day with food, and just increase it slowly as they tolerate it, up to the point of tolerance. You know, the more you take, the more ketone you will produce, basically. My whole, you know, feeling about this, you know, it needs clinical trials. I totally agree with that, but we're not there yet, and it's still years away from having the answers, you know, to know what the results are going to be. But in the meantime, it is just a food, and what do you have to lose? So there's my website, and I have a blog too. I try to talk about other things that I learned about Alzheimer's disease in my blog. But, thank you.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Okay.
My wife was diagnosed with MCI, which progressed to AD. A month ago, she started on Axona. Mm-hmm. Now, I can tell you that I heard you say that it peaks in 90 minutes and gone in 3 hours. Mm-hmm. In her case, she takes it at lunchtime, and I can tell you that 2 days out of 3, when she gets up in the morning, she can tell me what she had for dinner last night, which
wonderful.
Is a real test of whether or not it's working.
Right.
But my question is, would you recommend that we add coconut oil to that? And also, another question is, does the coconut oil have to be ingested, or can it be rubbed on the forearms, as I've read in other studies?
Yeah. I know a number of people that they take Axona in the morning. Like the FDA approved it for 1 dose a day, so they can't tell you to take 2 or 3. And I know they do have clinical trials going, and I think that's one of the questions they're going to try to answer. But there are a number of people that take that once a day, and then they use MCT oil and or coconut oil the rest of the day. And with the massage, I don't know of any studies showing that it raises ketone levels. However, there was one lady, her mother, even with 1 teaspoon of coconut oil, she would have diarrhea. But they had seen improvement when she took coconut oil. So her daughter just started massaging it into her, and then they felt that when they stopped the coconut oil, the improvements went away. And when they started massaging it, they came back. So, and some of the people that we know with ALS are actually massaging it over their weak muscles and that type of thing. So, this is something, it needs, again, testing to see what's really happening. But coconut oil and MCT oil are absorbed through the skin. They are, easily absorbed. If you put it on your skin, it disappears pretty quickly. And it's possible. It is possible that it could help.
All right, time for one more question.
Oh, sorry, I didn't leave a lot of time for questions.
Thank you. Actually, I have 2 unrelated questions. One is, what are the effects of all this palm kernel oil, coconut oil, on your cholesterols? The second question is totally unrelated, is what are the effects for the reasons for Alzheimer's? Have you ever heard any issues related to fluoridation in the water?
Second question, I have not heard about that. Heavy metals, various heavy metals, have been sometimes associated with Alzheimer's. That particular one, I really don't know anything about that one way or the other. But about the cholesterol issue, because that's a biggie, that's the doctor's greatest fear, putting his patient on it, especially someone that has a history of heart disease. And so I have a whole chapter in my book about that, about saturated fats and cholesterol. But there just aren't big, good studies, long-term studies of coconut oil, and cholesterol. There are some small studies, mostly in a few men for very short periods, and some of them were with hydrogenated coconut oil, and any hydrogenated oil will raise the cholesterol, and these are very old studies. Some relatively newer studies, and at that point they weren't breaking cholesterol down into HDL, good cholesterol, and LDL, bad cholesterol, when they did some of these, and when they declared that it was the artery clogging fat because it raised cholesterol levels. But some people it has no effect at all. Some people, if it raises it raises HDL cholesterol, and that's actually what we saw with Steve. His HDL tripled. It was like in the 30s, and it actually got up higher. It got up to as high as 105, and it's mostly in the 80s. He gets a huge amount of coconut oil every day. His triglycerides are never over 70. And his LDL, we saw first his HDL went up, and then his LDL came down, and his total cholesterol is 168. And this is with a large amount, and this is almost 5 years. So, but he's only one guy, but I have had a number of people, tell me their doctor expected their lipid profile to get much worse, and it didn't, and then I have had a few people say, well, their cholesterol did go up, and their doctor was alarmed about it, so they decided to stop it. But then you just have to decide, risks, benefits of everything, and which is more important to you, your brain and cognition, or, concern about having a heart attack. So, not an easy choice. Thank you.